Here we go.
Republican Party had begun in the 1960s, and its struggles over its path on civil rights, including forceful resistance from some of his own White House. Eisenhower enforced the Brown decision with the unprecedented use of federal troops to assure the safety of the children. He also intervened in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Following passage of the 1957 Act, he created the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. Ike, as president, enforced the desegregation of the armed forces after Harry Truman's order to do so had been largely ignored by the military, especially in the South. Likewise, Ike desegregated the District of Columbia. Democratic President Woodrow Wilson had resegregated it when he took office some 40 years earlier. Wilson had also resegregated all federal employment, which the Republicans had desegregated decades before. In his final State of the Union message, just days before leaving office, Eisenhower, for the first time, characterized civil rights as a moral issue. On the safety net issues, Ike did not simply block a rollback. In 1954, Eisenhower greatly expanded Social Security in the first major change since its creation in the New Deal, expanding its benefits to 10 million additional American workers. Among the most durable results in health care of the Eisenhower presidency were laws centered on employer-provided health insurance for employees. Eisenhower reforms became the central bulwark of health protection. Two authors described Eisenhower's accomplishments and failures on the healthcare front. David Blumenthal and James A. Marone sympathized that Eisenhower was always trying to square moderate or liberal notions of healthcare coverage, which he emotionally supported, with a pervasive fiscal prudence and budget-mindedness. On the upside, Eisenhower worked assiduously at healthcare, took risks, repeatedly crossing the American Medical Association, for example, and in the end, crafted a moderate Republican position that shifted the American healthcare debate. Eisenhower successfully bolstered the private health insurance system for workers and their dependents. The tax exemption for workplace health insurance spurred the rapid growth of private plans, a distinctive American institution that now covers 160 million people. In the 1950s, the United States chose its unique social insurance route. Eisenhower sought to move into the area Dewey had mapped out in 1944 of coverage for the elderly, the disabled, or otherwise indigent. The president tried to induce private sector insurers to find a way to underwrite these higher-risk persons, more difficult terrain, as Blumenthal and Marone put it. Eisenhower, in his last year, again supported broad health care efforts and backed an expansion of the Kerr-Mills legislation, which was about both hospital construction and services to those in need of health care. He had the solid support of Nixon on this. The support he did not have was Barry Goldwater. Only 2 votes in the United States Senate were opposed, Barry Goldwater and South Carolina's Strom Thurmond. This pair was the same one who would defy the vast majority of Republicans in the civil rights battles that were to become central in 1964. Dewey, Eisenhower himself, and Arthur Larson all pointed to the political imperative of a progressive Republican Party. Gabriel Haig gave a speech on October 14, 1955 in San Francisco to the Commonwealth Club of California, in which he proposed the economics of Eisenhower conservatism, which promised growth and opportunity. In an indication of how close the president and his special assistant were, Haig put a handwritten note on the copy he sent to Ike. He told the president that this was an early birthday present and inscribed it, "With affectionate regards." But it was in his resignation letter of July 7, 1958, in a very concentrated, brief, and powerful line, that Haig sets out the assimilation by the Eisenhower Party and Republicans of so much of what Tom Dewey had striven to have them embrace. It succinctly summarizes the core sense of Eisenhower republicanism. It is my view that Richard Nixon carried this impulse forward into the White House. Haig's summary is eloquent, vivid, and simple. It is almost pastoral in its imagery. Haig wrote to the president, "You have put a platform over the pit of despair without sacrificing the principle of self-reliance." Chapter 2, The Disruptive Decade, the 1960s and the formation of the Ripon Society. The Eisenhower years for most Americans were ones of steady economic improvement. There were major increases in home ownership, in college entrance for children of a growing middle class, and in travel. The country was not smug, but it was satisfied. TV shows of the era, pop music, and most films reflected back to the society its relative contentment. The country, after the end of the Korean War, returned to its post-World War II glow of national pride. Invasions of Suez by Allies, overthrows of regimes in Iran and Guatemala, an almost Gilbert and Sullivan American intervention in Lebanon, in which Marines landed on beaches where young Lebanese women were sunbathing in bikinis. All seemed distant, unthreatening. Americans were detached, even though they now knew the United States exercised global leadership. These events were happening on Eisenhower's watch. They had an easy trust that he would manage the interests of the United States well. There would not be reckless adventures. The anti-communist rhetoric about rolling back the Iron Curtain, advanced by his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had messianic, or at least Presbyterian, zeal to it. When the Hungarian uprising of autumn 1956 occurred, that rhetoric plumbed a lower decibel level. We became a destination and home for the refugees from the Soviet crushing of the Hungarians, but we did not send U.S. tanks across the Fulda Gap into East Germany toward Budapest. Yet the seams of the tight-fitting suit of conformity and moderation were stretching. Elvis Presley appeared. Important changes in the nation's attention were imminent. Two issues in particular would dominate the decade of disruption of the 1960s. One issue that moved into the center in the 1950s and would be a crucible for societal and political realignment in the 1960s was that of race. It, of course,
why are you guys acting like this?
Not since the Constitutional Convention, not since the Missouri Compromise, not since Dred Scott, not since the Civil War, and not since Plessy v. Ferguson at the end of the 19th century. Plessy was a Supreme Court decision that, in its separate but equal decision about school facilities for white and black Americans, countenanced a two-track system, the reality of which made a mockery of the language of the court. For decades, the seamiest and most brutal features of race relations, lynchings, the denial of voting rights, and the lack of basic justice for African Americans, had not prompted national action. This was true despite Governor Dewey's strong support for civil rights in the 1944 Republican Party platform, and despite efforts by liberals like Hubert Humphrey in the Farm Labor Party of Minnesota. Two events in the mid-1950s sped the country's engagement with civil rights issues. The first was the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka Supreme Court decision. In 1954, the Warren Court, so named for Eisenhower's appointee Earl Warren as Chief Justice, overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Eisenhower, despite hardly being in the vanguard of
This is either going to be interesting or really stupid. Oh. Just ate like half of that in one mouthful. Does this count as hand feeding? That's how my wife eats. Half of her plate in the first bite. And then half of what's left the next. You know what I'm saying, fellas? Does this count as hand feeding? Maybe a little bit. Here. This is kind of hurting the muscle in my back the way I'm crouching. Pretty cool though.
Civil rights, was determined to enforce the law, and did. He and his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, feared that the language of deliberate speed the court employed would encourage resistance to the court's order. That is exactly what occurred, and white citizens' councils formed all over the South to stall desegregation. It was not until the Alexander v. Holmes decision in Richard Nixon's first year as president that the court mandated what Eisenhower and Brownell had implored it to do at the time of the Brown decisions. The other event with powerful national impact was the death in 1955 of young Emmett Till, a Chicago boy who had gone to visit relatives in Mississippi. He was brutally murdered and disfigured by whites for allegedly making improper advances to an older white woman. His funeral at his church in Chicago, with an open casket displaying what had been done to him, drew thousands of mourners, and it brought visually and powerfully home the violence that all too often befell African Americans and went unnoticed. It deeply shocked Attorney General Brownell. With President Eisenhower's approval, he prepared and sent to the Congress the most sweeping and powerful civil rights bill ever submitted. The Democratic chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn, New York, who had a pending bill of his own, agreed to substitute the Eisenhower-Brownell bill for his legislation. Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, was still the darling of the Southern Bourbons who dominated the committee structures of both houses in Congress but especially the Senate. Lyndon's position on civil rights was complex. He had innate sympathy with the underprivileged and had taught Mexican-American kids in school. His political base was Texas. It was not as segregationist as Mississippi or Alabama, but its politics would not allow the election statewide of a progressive on race during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. At the same time, Lyndon's dreams extended far beyond Texas. He was ambitious to become the Democrats' presidential nominee in 1956 and feared that if the Eisenhower bill passed the House and came to the Senate, the weeks of unsightly wrangling and the bitterness of division in the Democratic Party would be so highlighted that his chances would be doomed. He called on his fellow Texan, Speaker Sam Rayburn, to slow down the progress of the House bill until it would be too late in the session for it to come to the Senate for full consideration and debate. Rayburn obliged his protege and fellow Southern Democrat. The huge and wrenching impact on both parties of the civil rights movement and the realignment of sectional party interests would await the convergence of Lyndon Johnson's public conversion and commitment soon after he became president to the cause of civil rights, with the strong and deep support by almost all Republicans for that same cause. Republican support was the sine qua non for the passage of the landmark civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s. The glaring exception to that Republican support was Senator Barry M. Goldwater, and that proved no small exception, as the Arizona senator became the party's presidential nominee in 1964. A second upheaval during the 1950s and had profound implications was that of Soviet technological breakthroughs in space. The suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and of others in Poland